This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 660 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before we get into the questions this week, I want to let you know about the Establish the Run draft kit. Establish the Run has rankings for any fantasy format that you might be playing in, and they continuously update as news breaks. You can get access to Evan Silva's top 150, and along with it, a change log that you can read to see why players are moving up and down his draft board. It's a great way to make sure you understand why players are ranked where they are. The goal is to help you make better decisions, not tell you who to pick. And if you're into best ball drafting, their strategy, rankings, and insight can help you out a ton with roster construction. I know I've learned a lot from their analysis. Establish Run gives you a different perspective on fantasy football than I do, and I think the combination of my work and theirs can help make this draft season a successful one. So head over to EstablishTheRun.com and purchase their draft kit. And when you do, use promo code JJ for a 10% discount. That's promo code JJ. And speaking of Establish the Run, they reached out and they want to hop in and join some of the others who have purchased and given out some late round draft guides. We've done this over the last few weeks and the response has been awesome. But basically, I know that not everyone has the means to just go out and buy a $25 fantasy football draft guide. And in turn, listeners of the show have bought guides to give out to other listeners who wouldn't be able to get the guide otherwise. Establish the Run wants to join in. They're donating 10 late round draft guides to listeners who wouldn't be able to get them. And they've got free content on their site, by the way, too. To be one of the 10 to get the guide, go to lateround.com and make sure you selected the late round draft guide for your order. When you go to checkout, you're going to use a promo code during that checkout process. Now, I did this last week and some people were late and they accidentally purchased the draft guide without realizing that the code didn't work. So please make sure that you're actually getting the discount before you purchase the guide. It'll show up as a $0 purchase if it worked. But if you go to lateround.com right now and use promo code THANKYOUETR, the first 10 people to do that at checkout for the late round draft guide will get it for free. That's THANKYOUETR. And remember, this is for people who may be struggling to purchase things like this. Please use the honor system and don't use the code if you're planning on purchasing the guide or if you can purchase the guide. I really appreciate it, and thanks to ETR for their generosity. And one more thing, don't forget to sign up for FanDuel Fantasy. For users who have yet to make a deposit on FanDuel Fantasy, you can deposit today to receive 2 free entries. All you have to do is deposit a minimum of $10 in your FanDuel DFS account, and you'll be instantly rewarded with 2 free vouchers. Be sure to deposit now and play for free. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. I know that was a lot at the top, but it's question time, and this first question is from Robert from Patreon. It says, Deebo said he doesn't mind the usage in the backfield. Plus, his new contract has some incentives to outdo what he did last season as a running back. How does this affect his ranking and other 49ers? So Deebo's work last year, his production last year when he was used more as a running back, wasn't that much better than when he was just a wide receiver, from a fantasy perspective. That's largely because Deebo had a target share per game of 33% before his role change. And then when the role changed, he ended up scoring rushing touchdowns at an absolutely obscene rate. He scored 7 rushing touchdowns over his final 8 games on just 53 rush attempts. And then he scored another one in the playoffs. I do think he's obviously better than the average Swiss Army knife player. And he'll probably score rushing touchdowns at a higher rate than normal. I'm not that ignorant when talking about regression. But a lot of what he did in 2021 was just unsustainable. And now we've got a quarterback change where that quarterback may be more inclined to throw it down the field. And he may take some of that rushing production near the end zone himself. When you've got a mobile quarterback, the wide receivers on that team need a few percentage points higher in target share in order to maintain their production. So not only was Deebo going to see natural volume regression, but now we've got a team with a mobile quarterback. I think Deebo is still fine this year and he's good, but I have a hard time drafting him as high as some will inevitably draft him. And how this impacts the running backs on the team is actually pretty interesting. Deebo started seeing more work on the ground last year in week 10. So he had 8 games where he wasn't seeing a lot of backfield work, and then 8 games where he would be in that 7 rush attempt or so range. When you split that season up in half, the other running backs on the team saw a slightly lower rush share overall when Deebo was seeing work in the backfield. They scored a similar number of fantasy points, but the rush share did drop, which is not surprising. Deebo missed a game against Seattle last year, and in that game, Elijah Mitchell saw 88% of the team's rushes. In his other games during that Deebo Samuel split, where Samuel was used more in the backfield, he averaged a rush share of 64%. And that leads me to the next question. This next question is from @Noninator on Twitter. It says, "Hey JJ, I know you've covered ambiguous backfields in the running back dead zone, but my question is regarding Elijah Mitchell. The Shanahan narrative falls apart once the circumstances are considered. Injuries. Is Eli actually a dead zoner considering what he would have done in 17 weeks? I don't think Mitchell is the worst running back dead zone pick, but I do think that he belongs in the dead zone. Now, I just mentioned that stuff about Deebo, and that's not necessarily good news. If Samuel is in that backfield more, that means Mitchell won't be. And even though Tyrion Davis-Price may not become anything, the 49ers' actions indicated that they may not be totally sold that Mitchell can be a true bell cow back. Will he lead that backfield in touches? As long as he's healthy, we should bet on that, yes. But a huge problem for Mitchell, even aside from Deebo, and aside from Trey Lance potentially stealing goal line looks, and aside from the competition in the backfield, it's the receiving work. Mitchell had 5 games last year without a target. He saw 2 or fewer targets in 73% of his games. And I'm not that bullish that the 49ers are going to target him at a much, much higher rate this year with Deebo Samuel back and with a mobile quarterback under center. Now, he's at least a second-year back. That's what you want out of the dead zone. You want rookies and second-year guys. And the 49ers should be a decent team with a run-heavy approach. I think he's someone who can meet expectation at his ADP, but far exceeding it may be difficult. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Dan. It says, "Hey JJ, is Cordarrelle Patterson criminally underrated by everyone, including yourself? You have him at RB33, 100 overall in your latest redraft rankings." I know he takes a lot of the, quote, pass metrics from your draft guide like age, but I'd argue that he hasn't had the running back wear and tear, so I'm not sure age is as much of an issue. He finished top 10 at both running back and wide receiver in PPR. The Falcons lost Matt Ryan and replaced him with Mariota. I see this as a positive for Patterson, as the option game could be interesting. The Falcons will be playing from behind a lot of the time, so increased dump-offs to Patterson are likely there. For Patterson's ADP, 806, where he'll likely have running back / wide receiver position eligibility, no real competition at running back on the team depth chart and favorable game scripts for a pass-catching running back, I think he's an absolute steal. Okay, so with this one, there's a lot to unpack. I mentioned this on a recent Mailbag episode, I think it was last week with Ezekiel Elliott, but we have to stop talking about cumulative numbers when referencing where a player ranked the previous season. Cordarrelle Patterson was the RB9 in PPR points scored last year. Yes, but he was the RB18 on a points per game basis. And as for the wide receiver ranking, he would have ranked 19th at wide receiver in total points scored last year had he been a wide receiver, not top 10. So really, Patterson was a mid-range RB2 last year. There's nothing wrong with that. And if he repeats that exact same performance this season, he will indeed exceed expectation. I talked about this a few weeks ago in a Mailbag episode. If you were guaranteed 14.7 PPR points per game from Cordarrelle Patterson, he would end up being a moderate breakout, meaning he'd exceed ADP expectation by 3 or more PPR points per game. And I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong, because we're all just projecting right now. No one is right or wrong. This is a safe space. We're just talking about how we feel about fantasy football. But I can at least share some evidence as to why I don't think Patterson is as much of a lock. First off, age. We've had one true breakout, or a player to exceed ADP expectation by 6 or more points per game. We've had one of them come from the middle round since 2011, who was past his 5th year in the league. And for the record, that subset of players, those older guys, they made up about 34% of all middle round running backs. Now, I wrote about this in my draft guide, but to put this another way, 9% of the true middle round breakouts at running back since 2011 were from older players. But 34% of the overall sample of middle round running backs were past their 5th year in the league. And even their moderate breakout rates weren't very good either. So that's a concern. The historical trend is a concern, even if you think and you understand that Cordarrelle Patterson hasn't gone through a traditional path to being a starter. I also don't really buy the idea that the Falcons are going to be trailing, so they're going to use Patterson more. The Falcons were bad last year. They ran the 8th most plays while trailing in 2021. I don't know if there would be an increased number of dump-offs when they not only added Drake London to the offense, and not only is Kyle Pitts another year in, but they were a bad team last year too. So yes, they're going to be trailing, but I don't know if there's an increase happening. And remember, mobile quarterbacks aren't necessarily a good thing for running backs in fantasy football. It's more neutral, but episode 510 covers that idea in more detail. And don't forget either, Patterson really dropped off towards the tail end of last year. A lot of his numbers came during the front half, and his production was boosted by a touchdown total that was about 3 touchdowns too high according to Pro Football Focus's expected touchdowns model. I just don't draft players like Cordarrelle Patterson very heavily in fantasy football. I'm not going to fault anyone for thinking that he's somewhat of an outlier, because he is. He's gone a non-traditional route to get here. But he seems like a player like Elijah Mitchell, who's more likely to just match ADP rather than be some league winner. This next question is an email and it says, "Hey JJ, love your work. Thanks. I was just wondering about your thoughts on Cam Akers. I don't necessarily love him because the last time we saw him, he didn't look great. But he seems to hit a lot of the marks for a breakout. He's one of my keeper options in a redraft auction league for $1. He's hard to pass up. But I have a lot of great options and just trying to work through all of them. Thanks, Ronnie." Akers is one of those players where it entirely depends where you're drafting him, like what platform you're using to draft him. In a best ball format where he sometimes falls into the 5th round, I have no problem getting him there. He'll have some spiked weeks in a good offense. And if you want him as part of a game stack or a team stack, that's totally reasonable. But in the late round draft guide update this week, I actually added Cam Akers as a player to avoid. And the main reason for that is because according to most ADP sources, the sources that people are going to be drafting with in their home leagues, Akers is like an early to mid 3rd rounder. And I cannot get behind that when there's so much good wide receiver talent in that range. I'm not even putting a lot of stock in how he performed last year either. He was actually better than Sony Michel in success rate during the Rams playoff run. The Rams just didn't get a lot of push with their offensive line, and they faced some really good rush defenses. My issue is twofold. Number one, I think there's a chance that we see more Darrell Henderson than some think. And that was reinforced when Sean McVay just this week talked about how he feels like they have 2 starting running backs on that roster. On top of that, the Rams just aren't using their running backs in the receiving game all that much. Since Todd Gurley left, no team has targeted the running back position at a lower rate than the LA Rams. Only Baltimore has fewer total running back targets than LA during this time. I just think a lot has to go Akers' way for him to be a solid RB1 in fantasy football. And if you're getting him in the 3rd round, you need that in his range of outcomes. This is why he's sort of a quintessential dead zone running back. He's someone who can return value, but I opt to go for wide receivers in that range who have better odds of being true difference makers. The last question this week is an email from @Cy_Claw13. It says, "Najee Harris was 1st in touches and 2nd in touches per game last season among running backs. He had 10 touchdowns last season in 17 games. How does Harris's expected touchdowns compare to actual touchdowns last season? And is more touchdowns the only way Najee improves from last season? Does Big Ben leaving affect his pass game upside? I currently have Harris as my RB7. Am I too low on him? Thanks in advance." So Harris last year more or less scored the number of touchdowns that he should have. I had him at a little over 11. He scored 10, so maybe he could have gotten a little bit more, but it wasn't egregious. I have concerns about Najee this year, though. And I've pushed him down my draft board seemingly every single week with more thoughts about his situation. He's going to see a ton of work. There's no doubt about it. He should at the very least be a top 2 round pick. I think that we should all agree there. But I do have concerns about how the volume is going to fluctuate through the air as a receiver. We might see his 14% target share per game rate once again this year, but it might be a little bit lower with a more mobile passer. But the Steelers are very likely to not be as pass heavy as they've been over the last couple of seasons. They've been 2nd in the NFL in each of the last 2 seasons in pass rate. With the quarterback change and a strong enough defense, I would be shocked if that remains the same. So a slight bump down in target share, he'd be able to usually handle, right? It wouldn't be that big of a deal. But then that's on top of the Steelers not throwing the ball more or throwing the ball the same amount. And that's where the concern lies. He might not see nearly as much volume through the air. So I think RB7 is fine for Najee, and I have him in that range as well. But I don't know if his ceiling is as high as someone like DeAndre Swift or even Saquon Barkley. So it just depends on your preference. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out lateround.com. You can subscribe to the free newsletter. You can become a patron. And you can also buy the Late Round Draft Guide for $24.99. People seem to like it. I think it would really help you out during your draft. But thanks, everyone. Really appreciate you listening. I'll talk to you next week.